Good morning, everyone. My name is Cerise Deveau, and I am the Director, Profile and Relationships for the Trans-Tasman Business Circle. I would like to acknowledge the original custodians of this land and pay our respect to the elders, past, present, and future, for their old memories, traditions, culture, and hopes of Indigenous Australia. I am delighted to welcome you to today's virtual briefing with David Hornery and Joseph Healy, co-founders and co-chief executive officers of Judo Bank. David and Joseph, welcome and thank you for being our guest speakers today. It is a pleasure to host you both again and virtually this time. As always, thank you to our partners, CBA, IBM, Red Hat, and ServiceNow. We are very grateful of your valuable support. If you're not familiar with the format yet, you can submit questions through our Q&A feature and have the option to vote any questions with a thumbs up button. The discussion today will be moderated by Sam Martin-Williams. Sam is a business leader, company director, and strategic advisor. Sam has also built a reputation for regional cities leadership and engagement, and is the chair for the Business Circle Hunter region. Sam, we are delighted that you were available to moderate today's session, and over to you.
Thank you, Cerise. Welcome, Joseph, David, and our large online audience today, particularly those across the Tasman and around the globe. It's a benefit of a platform like this that we can reach so many people and have such a large audience for today's session. It gives me great pleasure to have a conversation today with Joseph and David, co-founders and co-CEO of Judo Bank. Let's kick off. Can we have a short background why each of you decided you wanted to launch a bank in your mid-50s? Joseph?
Sorry for that. Technical problems at this end.
We've got you now. Perfect.
Well, we started thinking about Judo Bank in 2013-14, and it was in part because we saw a huge, what we describe as an industrialization of the way that banks were dealing with small businesses. And both David and I are very passionate about small business, small to mid-sized businesses, and about relationship banking as a core philosophy. So we started talking in earnest in late 2014, and in mid-2015, we decided to make the commitment to build what is today Judo Bank. But we wanted to build it based on traditional values of relationship banking, and built on modern technology. High touch, high tech is how we describe it. Because we felt there was a gap had been opening up in the market over a number of years, that small to mid-sized businesses really needed and were looking for something that was much more traditional in a relationship sense, and that was run by people who were very passionate about banking and about the importance of small to mid-sized businesses to the economy. And those are the things that motivated us. We were very, there was an element of risk, of course, when you embark on any new ventures, particularly building a new bank. But we were confident that we could build something that could make a difference, and taking a very long-term view on what that might look like, rather than trying to build something very quickly. We said, let's measure twice, cut once. Let's think about 10 years out from now, not 2 years out from now. And let's do this in a way that will leave a true legacy that defines the way that banking should be done to the small to mid-sized business economy.
David, from your point of view, anything to add?
I think that's a very good summary. We'd worked together for the best part of a decade previously at ANZ. We knew each other very well. We worked together for 7 or 8 years at NAB, as Joseph talked about, servicing small business, and it was a shared passion. I guess our view of what the benchmark for a small business relationship proposition was a banker that sits across the table from a customer, has the time and has the skills and has the intent to really get to know that customer, to build an understanding of that customer, and ultimately to build trust over time. Something that was in increasingly short supply, to the point that Joseph made about industrialisation, something that we cared a lot about, and something that we both, as we really began talking about the form and structure and substance that judo would take, it became increasingly clear that this was actually something that there was a huge opportunity to build, and it's something that would be enormously satisfying in doing so.
Being a young bank focused on SMEs, how do you want to make Judo Bank different from other financial institutions? What's going to be different about Judo Bank, do you think? Joseph?
Well, it's a great question, because obviously when we were planning judo and we were thinking about the demands and the risk involved in doing something like this, an important question was always to ask yourself, why and in what way would judo be different from what is already available in the market? Because if we were unable to satisfy ourselves and our shareholders and our customers that we were truly different, then what we would be doing is building a bank that frankly would be a mini-me of the larger incumbents, with none of the economies of scale or scope advantages of the large incumbents. So that question about how do we differentiate judo was at the forefront of our thinking, and the litmus test that we applied and continue to apply as we grow the business. We felt that service and relationships, or relationship banking in particular, was going to be very, very important. It's a much used term in the industry, but progressively that face-to-face contact, or having skilled bankers who understood the craft of banking SMEs, as something that has been lost to the Australian and New Zealand, and frankly to the economies in most major economies around the world, as banks have tended to focus in on maximizing shareholder value, of cutting costs, of standardizing, one size fits all. And so we felt that we've got to go back to fundamentals, get relationship and service right, get technology right, but most importantly, make sure that we were hiring and attracting and hiring people who were genuinely passionate about banking small to mid-sized businesses, and who wanted to invest and build the rest of their career doing just that. So those are the the kind of tests that we've applied. Can we be different? And the difference has got to be a face-to-face relationship. It's got to be speed. We've got to provide a service where we can give customers a decision within a few working days, not a few working weeks, has tended to be the experience. And we've got to keep the customer at the forefront of our thinking, the way that we think, talk and act. And by specializing in small to mid-sized businesses, rather than being a conglomerate in nature where you've got many different parts to your business, by specialization, it allows you to develop an expertise and an excellence that is difficult to develop when you're in a very broad-based financial services company.
So clearly some key...
Just as I might add, Samantha, I might even add just a sort of a slight footnote. Sorry, I was just going to add a bit of a footnote to that, Samantha. I think, as Joseph talked about, the caliber of bankers with the authority to be able to make decisions sitting across the table was always kind of one of the absolute cornerstones of our capacity to execute. The build of judo, one of the interesting things is that we put all of our bankers through a 3-hour exam before they join, really to test for their credit skills, their ability to look at balance sheets and cash flows, the 4 C's, if you like, around cash flow and around character and around capital already in the business, as well as collateral, and make a holistic view. And that 3-hour sort of closed book exam, to which there are no appeals, the pass rate has, we've never managed to get more than half of the people that sit that exam through it, right? So it does speak to the calibre of people, or one of the elements of the calibre of people we've been able to join, but also it speaks to the, as Joseph said before, the industrialisation of the banking of SMEs within the four major banks, who've pulled all of that work and that decisioning away from the front line. And it's kind of an interesting development within the industry, but it's been a key criteria by which the bankers that join us have to accredit themselves.
We might actually stay with that theme about your people. The VVent series has discussed lots of topics over the course of the last few weeks: leadership, resilience in leadership. Last week, I was on one of the VVent sessions with John Brogden, chairman of Lifeline, and he talked a lot about people missing the informal water cooler chats or the corridor chats, and the loss of that being significant during this time. Can we focus on what you're doing for your people at Judo Bank at this time, and how is that setting you apart in terms of how you're leading your teams during this crisis? Joseph?
Yes, Chris, a great question, Sandy, because obviously we're a young company, and I emphasised that because when you're a relatively new organisation and you've hired lots of people, we've hired close to 200 staff over the course of the last 18 months, we were conscious that as a young company, your culture is evolving almost in front of you, and you're trying to make sure that people feel very much part of the organisation, whilst at the same time you're trying to manage and cope with what is a huge experiment in people working from home. And it's certainly different when you're young and new relative to being a more mature and established businesses where culture and norms are well defined and work routinely. So we've gone to great length to make sure that there's regular daily contact with our people. We have several forums where we have all the staff involved on a weekly basis. We have different team forums that occur. We've had 3 already this morning, for example. Communicating constantly and making sure it's a two-way process, that we're not just updating people, but we're seeking their feedback. Making sure it's easy for people to work from home. So we've given people allowances to make sure that their home environment is suited for working. And we've also said to people that if you don't feel comfortable in working from home, then we've made arrangements in the office where we can segregate groups into what we call red and blue teams. So the communication emphasis has been a big priority. But you mentioned in the beginning of your question that people are social animals, and whilst working from home is a great option for some, the vast majority of people want to be in the office, working, bumping into their colleagues, dealing with issues real time, watching the body language as well as reading the emails and the conversations that take place. Body language, as you would well know, is so important into the fabric of an organization. And so we've done a lot of emphasis on communication. Both David and I, in addition to the group discussions that we have, will randomly call a dozen or so of our colleagues every day just for a chat, checking in to see how they're going, and giving people a sense that this is actually going to strengthen our culture. We didn't plan this, but sometimes in adversity you find that you've got strengths and qualities that would otherwise take a long time to evolve, and we've certainly been thrilled with the spirit de corps, I guess, of the team, managing through what is a huge experiment in trying to make a new organization, which as a bank, of course, we're dealing with customers some of whom are facing some difficulties. So that just adds to the complexity of the challenge. But as things stand today, this has strengthened our organization, but we're never complacent about this, because it is very unusual for a lot of people many of whom are, as I said earlier, are new to the organization and building relationships within the organization. But as things stand, we've been really thrilled with how it's worked thus far. David?
I think I'd add one thing that I think wraps up a part of, I think, what Joseph said, which really goes to that communication piece. And that's absolutely about the consistency. It's about having a consistent message at all layers of the organisation. But there's a broad heading there too, which is the tone from the top. Right? People look up to sort of assess the body language of the leadership of the company, and that this concept of calm, clear, progressive leadership is a really important tone to be conscious of as the leader of a company, as leaders of companies, and the executive team that leads Judo, being aware of that. Yep. And that does go to consistency of communication, but it goes to interaction. It goes to sort of promoting a culture where, you ask the question, particularly in the current times, are you okay? Right? Because not everybody deals with these situations in the same way, or, some find it difficult, some don't. But being really conscious of the shadow you cast in leadership, because people tend to pick that up and they mirror that. And if there's a calm, clear, progressive, considered, and open and transparent approach, that takes a lot of the pressure or uncertainty out of the situation for many people.
You both touched on the difficulty for customers in and around this time. And I imagine Judo Bank and your people would be having difficult conversations with your customers as well. What are your obligations to support your customers at Judo Bank?
I might take that question, David. I mean, I think, of course, how we engage with our customers, how we look after our customers we believe will define our reputation with those customers and in the market for a long time to come. And so our whole approach was to, first of all, recognize the seriousness of the environment that we were in. I mean, this is an extremely unusual situation that we're all facing that's impacted virtually every business, some more than others. But for most small to mid-sized businesses, there's been an impact. And again, keeping in mind that it's close to 30 years since we last had any major recession in our economies, it was important that we were very empathetic in dealing with customers, being on the front foot. We went through internal workshops and training sessions about how we should approach our customers. Now, of course, as conditions have progressed since the onslaught of this environment we're living in, the ability to go and see customers has not been possible. So you've got to be on the phone doing webinars such as this, making sure that our customers are facing into the issues that they should face into, not being overly pessimistic or not being too optimistic, but being realistic about what's going to happen over the next 6 to 9 months. And making sure then that we understand what we need to do. And our whole bias in all of this is to help our customers manage through these conditions, knowing that the vast majority of businesses have never faced anything like this before. In fact, the vast majority of our bankers haven't faced anything quite like this before, hence the coaching and the visibility of our senior people. But, to David's earlier comments, being authentic in how we deal with our people, being authentic in how we deal with our customers, with a bias to supporting businesses to, first of all, survive the environment that we're in, but make sure also that they are taking steps so that they can succeed as we come out of this environment. And so it's a bit of what do we need to do today to make sure there's enough cash in the businesses so that they can meet their commitments. But what do we need to do to make sure these businesses are fit when we eventually come out of this environment? So, this has been a test of, going back to an earlier question about why is Judo different. We've taken a very customer by customer approach rather than a one size fits all, and with a huge bias to making sure that we support our customers responsibly, but with a view to making sure that they're fit as we come out of this, rather than simply doing enough to keep them in business. We've got to make sure they're fit coming out of this whole environment.
David, anything additional to add?
No, I think it actually sort of links in a way back to one of the first questions you asked, Samantha, which was what are the things about judo that's different? You know, central to a best practice relationship-based proposition is having a coverage level such that your bankers can have the time to be able to spend with customers. I mean, it is situations like this where relationship banking is at its absolute best, where it really comes to the fore. And that's for the customer because our bankers are available. I mean, right now we've got 650 odd customers to whom we've lent about $1.5 billion. But because we're in a growth phase, we've got 55 odd bankers, right? And so those bankers have the time and the coverage ratio so that they can be on the phone proactively supporting the customer. And a lot of the feedback we've had is it was fantastic that the judo banker was on the phone, because the experience in the broader market is that the phone calls aren't getting answered, that there are so many calls going into particularly the big banks that it's actually quite difficult to get the calls returned. So, you know, we've got bankers that have been on the phone proactively, have the time, and the custom sets that allow them to do that. And that's, you know, there are many cornerstones to make up what is a truly, you know, world-class banking proposition to small business, but coverage, availability, consistency is one of those, and that's kind of never been more important than it is at the moment.
Some of our questions are coming through, which is great. Before we flick to them, I'd be really interested to get both of your views on how the banking reforms that were brought in post-GFC and of recent years, how they have made a difference either way during this situation from your perspective, Joseph?
When we go back to the GFC, well, there was a major development in the banking industry just before the GFC, and that was the introduction of what is known as the Basel II regulatory environment that, amongst other things, it made it much more attractive for the banks to lend money to households rather than to businesses. And so you had this capital weighting concept where banks could lend. If I was lending $1 million to you to buy a holiday home, I had to allocate 30% capital against that loan. If I'm lending $1 million to you to invest in your business, I'm having to allocate 100% capital against that loan. So this created a distortion in the system that made lending to households much more attractive from a bank point of view than lending to small businesses. And that really began what I would call a process of financialization of the banking industry from around about 2008 and beyond that. And by financialization, I mean that it became a product pushing business where it was all about how much lending am I doing in the mortgage market? How many products am I selling my customers? And the whole language and culture within the industry, and both David and I were part of that, so we're not distancing ourselves from it. We're very much part of it. Was all about market share. It was all about lending or selling, and the customer became almost a byproduct of that discussion. You know, there wasn't a discussion about what are we doing with our small business customers and how are they coping in different parts of the country. It was all about how much lending we've done this week. So I think the whole culture inside the organization shifted inside the industry, and again, this is true of banking industry globally, shifted away from the customer towards a very strong product ethos and a very strong maximizing return on equity, which of course then supported compensation or bonus payments, and the customer became a byproduct of all of that. So I think we saw here in Australia with the Royal Commission last year, quite graphically, some strong evidence of this phenomena that I just described, where the customer really became a second order consideration. And so if there was one thing about the changes in the industry since last year, since the Royal Commission, I think has been a huge wake up to the deeply rooted cultural problems that are embedded in the industry and the need to get back to the core reason why banks exist. Banks are there as servants, not masters of the economy. They're there to help people like you and I and small businesses make our dreams come true by buying or investing in our homes or in our businesses. And that self-interest should not be the mantra. It should be the customer and the society's interest being the guiding force behind the banks, how the banks should be run. Now, it's far too soon to say whether the banks have learnt their lessons. And of course, this is a great case study to just test how well the banks are attuned to their social responsibility. Time will tell. The marketing has been impressive. But it's going to be the substance that really counts, and how well banks really look after the customers during these very difficult times. I think will define the industry for the next decade or so.
Let's switch to some questions, because there's some terrific questions coming through, and we want to make sure that we're touching on the wide audience's issues as well. One of the questions that's trending at the moment is around lots of people having lost work and they've got reduced incomes, but most of their expenses are fixed. Thus the household debt increasing. So the question is, how much of an issue is increased household debt and reduced purchasing power likely to be for SMEs? If we could get your views on that, David, first.
Sure. Well, I think it's kind of one of the significant to be determined. I mean, if you look at the expectations of sort of the cohort of economists that are commenting on what the next 6, 9 to 12 months looks like, consumer confidence, consumer spending, consumer indebtedness, and so forth are, real pivots for the Australian economy. So there are clearly varied perspectives on that. You have some talking about a V-shaped recovery, and that the most optimistic suggest that will happen sooner rather than later. I think although the middle of the rump of opinion, if you like, is that a V-shaped recovery is unlikely, and that actually it's more likely to be a U. And that actually while the government has been very substantial and decisive and very targeted in the way it has sought to intervene in the economy, both at the consumer and employee level as well as the small business, much of that's yet to hit, and the effectiveness is yet to be determined. I don't think we would be anything other than complimentary about how substantial and decisive they were in making those changes. But, what are the medium to longer term implications? I think, Samantha, is really yet to be seen. Consumer confidence, consumer spending are fundamental underpinnings of a recovery. They slate back to unemployment. You can see that the variations in forecasts go from about 9% to about 13%. And so, unemployment is going to be the prime driver of that. So they are pivotal. The government has stepped in substantially. It's really going to be a case of time will tell as to, how the consumer reacts, how employment confidence then starts to change in terms of their spending habits, or how it does or does not change their spending habits, and how quickly business, therefore employment, therefore spending, therefore investment comes back online. But I think overall, our perspective would be that it's more likely to be a U-shaped recovery than a V-shape.
David, can I just draw on a point you made? And it was about mixed views and, differences in opinion about what the recovery is going to look like. What about for Judo? What percentage of your customers are doing it tough now? This is one of the questions coming through from our online audience. And who's doing pretty well and who's doing it tough at Judo at the moment? What are you seeing in your experience?
So we've got the benefit as we were saying before, given that we've got 650 odd customers, I mean, we are very closely in touch with every single one of them. And the very, very substantial proportion of those are actually in okay shape, right? So it's easy to sort of focus on those that are doing it tough, and that becomes the whole story. Substantial, 3/4 plus of the SME economy is doing okay, and with the level of government support that it will have, both directly and indirectly through the support of its employees, will make it through, right? The danger comes if this becomes a 12 to 18 month drawn out process. I mean, that makes it more difficult. But the sectors that are experiencing stress are all of those, the ones that you read about. There's tourism, there's hospitality and pubs and clubs. So there's a whole, there's a range of industries that are in the forefront where revenues can be down 80 or 90%. There's then sort of the second order effect that are the suppliers to those industries, or those that have had their supply chains disrupted. For example, importing component parts for manufacturing out of China, for example. So the industries that you would expect to be hit are those, that correlate to the movement of people around. That's travel, that's entertainment, that's hospitality, tourism, but there's also a range of the small education community. The small educators have had a tough time until the government stepped in with its series of subsidies for schools, right? Particularly for early learning centres and so forth. So but it's important. It's important here, I think, to emphasise that the substantial majority of Australian SMEs, while we'll all be doing it tough to some extent, well, that's not quite true. There's a number that are actually doing very well, right? Who happen to be in industries that are benefiting from, the current circumstances. But as a generalisation, the substantial portion of Australian SMEs, while they may be under a level of stress, have shown a level of creativity, have received a sufficient level of support, and are in industries that are going to be okay to make it through.
Joseph, anything to add before we move through to our next question?
No, I think that was a comprehensive commentary. I mean, we're very conscious that we're at a Trans-Tasman forum, so the New Zealand aspect to this is equally relevant, and we watch developments in New Zealand quite closely. But as David said, I mean, whether it's Australia or New Zealand, any business that relies on foot traffic customers, to use that very broad generalization, has been impacted by the virus. So, and the other thing is that David I think quite rightly made the point that the extent to which businesses that are not impacted may become impacted in the future will depend on the duration of this whole current state of crisis. So that's something obviously that all of us are watching very closely and looking for signs of improvement, lights at the end of the tunnel. Touch wood, it seems like both Australia and New Zealand are seeing more positive news than is the case elsewhere around the world. So nothing much to add to David's commentary.
And not much difference from your perspective that you're seeing in and around major cities versus regional areas? Something I have to ask, being based in the Hunter Valley.
Well, I mean, most major cities, this week has been a big improvement, but they've been like ghost towns walking around Sydney or Melbourne over the last month. It's been quite eerie, just the way that everything seems closed and very few people walking around or driving around. I have seen a significant change over the course of the last week, maybe going back a week now, where there are a lot more cars on the road, a lot more people walking down Collins Street or George Street in Sydney and Melbourne. So you do sense, and certainly in the major centres, we're starting to see a noticeable pickup in activity. And certainly from our customer point of view, we're not seeing any noticeable difference between our more regional based and more urban based customers. Oh, I can't hear that.
As a market disruptor, and many of the things that you've talked about previously indicate that you really are disrupting the market. How is Judo using technology to differentiate itself in terms of mobile, engaging experience, both for an internal audience, your staff, but also your external audience, your customers? How are you using technology?
Shall I start that question, David, and pass to you? I mean, if I go back to my opening remarks, I mean, we saw this as an opportunity to build a new bank from a blank piece of paper, and to look at I mentioned culture already being critical to us, but also building a technology-enabled organization, not an organization that was defined by technology, but enabled by technology. We want it to be defined by our customer-facing relationship philosophy. We developed technology, cutting-edge technology from scratch, using technology as a service, working with a whole range of market-leading suppliers, with all of our data sitting in the cloud. We wanted to make sure that our bankers find it easy to do business with our customers, and our customers find it easy to do business with us. We wanted to make sure that our bankers are spending 80% of their time with our customers, not 80% of the time sitting inside the organization dealing with complicated legacy technology. So technology has been very much at the forefront of how we have built Judo, but we don't, as I mentioned, we don't describe ourselves as a fintech. We don't describe ourselves as a technology-led company. We're very much a people-led company, with cutting-edge technology being there as a critical enabler of that. David, is there anything that you would add to that?
Not really, other than just to emphasize the first point that you made, which is that you have an incredible benefit when you start with a blank sheet of paper technologically. And as Joseph said, I mean, everything that we've built is based in the cloud, right? So all of the sort of the connectivity issues, the update issues, the server and hardware-based issues are something that you can avoid. And in many ways for us, in terms of our agility, in terms of our product competence, our capacity to turn things around, as well as our security and so forth, we're hugely advantaged just because we've been able to start with that blank sheet of paper.
Have you specifically been drawing on anything during this particular time with COVID to help solve any of those challenges or meet business demands? Is there anything you've been doing differently with technology over this particular period? Joseph?
Not particularly. I mean, I think, you know, we've been in a rapid build phase technologically for 2 to 3 years. And so, you know, we are consistently rolling out new technology all the time. And that comes in terms of functionality, that comes, you know, we've attracted about $1.5 billion worth of deposits. So the technology and the quality of our depositor experience, in addition to our lenders, you know, has all now been rolled out and is getting better, and we will bring more products to the deposit market. In terms of the day-to-day use of technology, I would sort of say it's more, particularly as we track, you know, what each and every one of our lending customers, what situation they're in, then we have a natural advantage because of we've got such a flexible system. But no, not largely a new use. Perhaps using the strength of the existing technology even more would probably be a better way to frame it.
Joseph, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, sure. Just adding to, can you hear me? Yeah. Just adding to David's comments, one of the things that our people are consistently feeding back to us is that relative to what they have been used to in the past, that our technology is truly at the cutting edge, in that they key in or log in once, and then they have access to all of the systems rather than having to log into several disjointed systems. And secondly, one of the pleasing things about this current environment that we're in is that it was relatively seamless for our people to go and work from home, take their laptops, log into the bank systems, communicate with their colleagues, and not deal with or have to deal with antiquated technology or systems that weren't speaking to each other. So in many ways, one of the positives that come out of this crisis is that our technology has really stood up to the demands that were placed on it, and we've been able to build this organization working remotely, but actually not finding that technology is becoming a constraint on being able to do that. And I think that was a positive thing.
Another really important pillar in the banking system is the regulatory framework. And I'd be really interested to what extent does the regulatory framework, the settings, either assist and or hinder what Judo's doing in and around its business model? And if so, what's your view on any changes? Can I go to you, Dave?
Yeah, look, so we received our banking license almost, it's about a year and a week ago. So we sort of literally just went past our first year birthday as a bank. And I think, look, the reality, Samantha, in building the bank and working with the regulator in the building of the foundations of Judo from a governance, regulatory, risk perspective was, a very, very intense process. But I would quickly hasten to add, absolutely as it should be. I mean, it is a very substantial regulatory system here, and that the criteria for becoming a bank in Australia are substantial, multidimensional and deep. Having said that, our experience with the regulator was that it was an iterative process. Yep, perhaps traditionally 10 or more years ago, where it was kind of, a large drop of papers would come down and then you'd get an answer, 3 months later. For us, we found, while intense and while absolutely forensic, that it was an interactive process, that our responses or our submissions, our risk frameworks, our risk appetites, all of the appropriate documents and frameworks were submitted, and we got high quality feedback on a regular basis. It was forensic. It's exactly as it should be. But I think of reforms, particularly since the GFC, that the government has sought to introduce. I think particularly since, answering the question is a little more recently, since 2017, the government has really sought and been seen to support an opening up of the banking sector, right? And that the fast track program that APRA instituted was one of half a dozen different elements that were put in place. And fundamentally, that was done because one of the most, or perhaps the most enduring way to drive change in an industry is to introduce material competition, right? And so, we have the banking license. It was an intense process, but what it means now is that, at least we like to think in the SME sector, that opening up of the system has provided a new challenger bank that's really going to set a different bar in terms of the service proposition to small business.
Joseph? Just come off unmute. Great.
I think David's covered it well. I think it's very important that the regulatory standards are at a very high level. I mean, being a bank is a great privilege for any organisation. We're able to access deposits to fund our business, and those deposits are subject to government guarantees. I mean, that's a unique privilege given to banks, not given to other industries. And therefore, the standards that are demanded of banks by the regulator are quite rightly set at a very high level. And that in itself is a sobering thought for anybody thinking about becoming a bank, because it's not like starting up any other new business. You've got to meet a whole range of criteria that are largely set for the whole industry. Not a lot of differentiation between the small bank and the big bank. There's a rule book and a policy framework that you have to comply with. And I don't know the figures, but I would imagine that there were a number of would-be banks that started off on the journey to become a bank, but just then became quite overwhelmed by the requirements that are put in place to get that accreditation, and therefore decided not to continue. We feel privileged and honoured to have been given a banking licence, and great respect for the regulatory environment that we operate in.
Some would say that it's great timing for Judo. You've got a new service and relationship offering in the market. You've not got legacy in and around people and systems and processes. One of the questions that's coming through is, how are you defining the human skill capabilities that are critical to get the service relationship right and understand how well that exists with your team today, and knowing whether new team members are contributing in building those capabilities as well? Joseph, can I start with you?
Yes, of course. It's a great question, because at the end of the day, the organisation will be defined by the calibre of its people and the culture that acts as the glue that binds these people together. We invested hugely in what we define as the norms, the cultural norms that we expect of people joining Judo. I mean, David mentioned earlier on about some of the technical skills that we test people on before they come into the organisation, but we really want people in the organisation to see banking as a credible and respectable profession. Now, I emphasise a profession because the industry has been lacking in professionalism for at least a decade, if not longer, and the Royal Commission highlighted that quite graphically. So the first thing that we say to people joining Judo is that you have to be committed to working in a profession that requires certain standards of you in terms of technical knowledge, but also ethical standards. And and part of our whole interviewing process is around the ethical fit and the cultural fit that people have with Judo as an organization. We also say that banking is first and foremost the business of managing risk. And so we want people to see risk management as being a core competency, no matter what you're doing inside the organization, whether you're a frontline banker or a relatively junior analyst in our operations team. This is an industry that is fraught with different kinds of risks and needs everybody to think like a risk manager, even though we have specialist risk management people inside the organization. So the culture is important. The ethic, the commitment to professionalism is critical to us. I mean, most of our people have either qualified through the Institute of Bankers at FINSIA program or are in the process of doing that. We encourage everybody to take professional qualifications. And the question around risk management, you've got to understand risks. You've got to be thinking about risks, not just the ones that you're looking at today, but the risks that are 2 or 3 steps ahead, and what could go wrong. How would we mitigate those risks? So I think that whole, and it goes back to the point that David made earlier on about the tone from the top, that this is a bank, and the industry of professionalism is critical to the future success of the banking industry. It has been an industry devoid of professionalism for far too long, and establishing Judo as a differentiated player in an industry dominated by giants, one of the things that we want to differentiate ourselves by is a very high level of professionalism and a very high level of ethical commitment to the way that we do business with people, the way we engage with regulators, and the way that we engage with our people inside the organization.
I think that's actually answered one of our other questions, which was, what are the new skills you feel your bankers need to learn so that they are prepared for a new normal? So what I heard was, professionalism, risk management, good qualifications, so depth and breadth. So I think we've also answered that as we've gone along. Can I ask you what you're seeing with your clients at the moment at Judo? Are there any clients that are really impressing you with new business models, new ways to respond in this particular crisis? Are you seeing any examples that you could share with us about your client base? Maybe we'll start with Joseph. Can I go to you?
Yes, that's well, one of the positive things, if there is a positive thing to take out of the crisis that we are in, has been the ability of a number of businesses to adapt, to demonstrate agility, to deal with issues really quickly. And actually, I passionately hope that one of the consequences of this environment is that people, and we've certainly been encouraging our customers to do this, is to have a fresh look at your business model. You rarely get the time to get off the dance floor of life onto the balcony and look down and say, is this really the business model that's going to see me through the next 10 years? What else should I be doing? How should we be thinking about technology? Now, in the normal hustle and bustle of business, it's very hard to get that time to get off the dance floor and think about the investments or the reconfiguration of the business. But we have been encouraging businesses to do that, and not just customers of ours. We've been talking to a number of businesses about the opportunity now to invest in technology, to transform the business model. And I can think of 4 examples of businesses that in trying to deal with the crisis that has been thrown on them, have actually made significant transformational changes in their business, demonstrated excellent agile thinking, and will come out of this fundamentally different shape, but really well set up for the future. And that's a piece of advice that I would give, not just to businesses, but also to people, that we're not hopefully ever going to find a time where we're sitting at home for a month, where a lot of other things and distractions in life are no longer available to us. And don't waste the crisis. Use this as an opportunity to have a fresh look at yourself, at your business, and about the future that you want. And this is one of, I think, the byproducts of the environment that we're in. Don't waste the crisis is something that we constantly tell our customers about to do.
David?
Oh, no, I think that's a great response. I mean, I think one of the things that I think underpins the reason we do what we do is that you're always, it's so easy to be inspired by individual small businesses. I mean, we have hundreds and hundreds of customers now, but even the individual stories, Judo, that Joseph alluded to, are quite inspiring. I mean, you see, I was up on the northern beaches of Sydney over the weekend, and the place that you normally go and have breakfast is of course closed, but they've got the sort of, they've set up a table out the front. The woman that ran it, who I've known for a decade, said, well, I'm doing 3 times the turnover because everybody's coming down to make sure I survive. We have a gym, a gymnasium customer, and he's leasing out his equipment to people who want to be able to exercise at home. Just get a minivan, drop it off. I mean, customers that have got manufacturing capability that are actually manufacturing personal protective equipment now, right? They've just retasked. All individual stories, but all indicative, I think, of the inherent creativity of Australian, small businesses. They really apply themselves to get through, and it's kind of one of the reasons I think we do what we do. That kind of story.
A question for our friends across the Tasman about possible application or expansion, whether it be to New Zealand or to another area like Singapore. What are the plans for Judo? And what are you seeing also with banks in those footprints, New Zealand, for example? Joseph, can I go to you?
Yeah, please. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you've asked that question, because we talk, I mean, a lot of this conversation has been with an Australian lens, but half the senior executives at Judo are New Zealanders, and including myself, actually, a New Zealander with a Scottish accent. We see New Zealand as very much an integral part of this Trans-Tasman economy. Obviously, I'm stating the obvious, but an integral part of how we're thinking about our future direction. What we said is let's establish the business in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and in Perth. Let's make sure that that we're delivering on everything we said that we would do, and doing that really well. And then the next horizon for us is to open up in Auckland, Wellington, and if I had my way, in Queenstown as well. But it's very much part of our planning. I mean, we see the dynamic in the New Zealand marketplace in terms of banks is very, very similar to the Australian marketplace. I mean, the banks in New Zealand haven't been tarnished reputationally with the same brush that the Australian banks have been, but 9 out of every $10 lent by banks in New Zealand is lent by Australian-owned banks. And we see the same opportunity that small businesses are getting a pretty ordinary service from a lot of the big banks. And so the opportunity for Judo to enter the market as a challenger and to make sure that we're growing our company in a Trans-Tasman sense is very much part of our thinking.
David, we've got time for one final comment. This has gone so quickly, we've run out of time. It's been an excellent conversation. But in regards to expansion, your thinking, where are there gaps in the market that you think Judo can deliver a great customer experience for?
Look, I think just building on what Joseph said, I mean, we are a specialist. I mean, we are a small business banking specialist. And we think that there is enormous room to just grow within our area of specialisation within Australia. We will roll out to be a truly national business. We think we can grow a lending portfolio in Australia of, say, $12 to $13 billion over the course of the next few years, and to really set that benchmark for what it means to really relate to manage the relationship banking proposition to small business. We will roll out more products. So we've come to market with a series of sort of half a dozen lending products and a banking guarantee and an asset finance product, as well as a series of deposit products. We will continue to expand that. But we're also very laser-like in what we're doing here. We are an SME relationship banking specialist with a huge potential growth in front of us. And the other thing that sort of sits underneath all of this is that we've got 15 very substantial global institutional backers that have provided a capital, a very strong capital foundation, a very strong liquidity foundation for us to be able to execute to that. So more products and more customers over time, and we think we can grow into a substantial force, not the biggest, but absolutely the best in terms of that relationship proposition.
Well, certainly what I'll take away today is a comment you made, Joseph: servants, not masters of the economy. And it's a very privileged position to be a bank. I'd like to now hand over to Johnny, founder and managing director of the Circle, to close today's session and also conduct our business sentiment survey. Thank you.
Samantha, thank you so much for taking us through that wonderful presentation by both David and Joseph. We come to our business sentiment poll now and invite all of our listeners to share with us, and particularly for David and Joseph to hear what our listeners are feeling about their own approach to their own business, how they're feeling about the government, in terms of how long they feel this whole thing will go on for. And we hope that this met your objectives. Joseph and David, thank you so much. What a fascinating presentation. You're at the cutting edge of the small business economy. You see the best, and you see the challenges, and you see the innovation. you know, your expression of having the chance or the imperative to leave the dance floor and go up to the balcony. So many people have been forced to the balcony without even wanting to take that into account in their planning. And the fact that you've seen so much resilience in our sector is very, very encouraging. We see the doom headlines, but we also feel the innovation and some of the examples you described are uplifting for us and give us all scope for growing, not only within Australia, but we're delighted to hear your New Zealand roots and your New Zealand representation. You cover your Kiwi accent very well, Joseph, but you actually, we love to hear that you've got so many Kiwi backers there. So we'll come over to the results of the poll in a moment. And here they are now. People are feeling generally innovative, which is very encouraging for the SME sector. Great support for the governments we're seeing throughout all of our surveys. And looking at 12 months, this is quite consistent with our surveys. And we'll leave, prior to our last word, we'll leave the last word to both Joseph and David, but I'd like to thank also our wonderful series partners, CBA, IBM, Red Hat, and Service New South Wales. You give us the imperative, you give us the opportunity to make these series happen. David, to you, and then to Joseph, the last word. Thank you. Okay, to Joseph.
Thanks, Johnny. And look, it's been a pleasure to be able to spend some time with Trans-Tasman again. We presented together, I guess, 6 or 9 months ago with you, Johnny. You know, we both have a huge amount of time for the work that the Trans-Tasman does and the topics that it covers. So thanks for the opportunity to be able to speak. It was very enjoyable.
Thank you. And Joseph.
Well, I'd echo David's comments. It's always a pleasure. I mean, and this is a highly respected forum, and I congratulate you on the long history and I think a very rosy future that this particular forum has in encouraging a Trans-Tasman business dialogue. It's for me, it's one of the premier forums that we have in the country, and it's been a great pleasure to have been participating this morning. So for that, I thank you very much, Johnny.
Thank you very much, everybody, and have a good week.